Hey, welcome to Breaking the News Plus on this Wednesday night. So as we get closer to the end of the legislative session, we still do not have a deal. And that is why our political chief reporter, Danny Spiewak, lives at the Capitol now. He is there outside the room where it happens, where it's still not happening.
That's right behind me, the governor's cabinet room. This is where we do our stakeouts now. We sit here for hours waiting for lawmakers to come out and give one-word responses saying things are going well or they're not going well. But it's been an interesting last week or so as they're trying to strike a deal on this budget framework.
Danny, I remember several weeks ago, if not months, Leader Hortman and Speaker Demuth said, "We think we're going to get done on time." But today we heard Senator Erin Murphy say a special session is very, very likely. What do you think?
Yeah, it's starting to kind of get to that point where the writing's on the wall. I think there was early optimism, as you know, especially in the House, which is tied between DFL and Republicans. They had this power sharing agreement that, of course, took a long time to get to. But things were going pretty well. The co-chairs on the committees from each different party were working well together. There wasn't a lot of that bitterness, at least in public. There was a lot of optimism that, even in a divided legislature, that they might be able to get this budget done on time. But, now that the leaders have been negotiating the bigger framework, which will kind of guide this final week of the session as lawmakers can finish up their bills, as they've gotten into those negotiations, they just have not been able to get past certain issues. And we're at a little bit, I don't want to say a standstill, because I think that they have probably made progress on a lot of issues. But now at this point, if they don't have a deal here soon, they're really running up against the wall here on May 19th. And the staff, as we've been told, needs time to get the bills ready, to edit them, to make sure there's no errors. And at this point, it's just maybe too much of a time crunch to where they think they're probably going to need a special session.
Danny, is there any specific part of a bill or any bill that sits and stands alone that they just cannot see eye to eye on, that each side is digging their heels on?
That's a really good question. And it's hard to say what's actually being talked about in the room. The legislative leaders from both sides have really not revealed a lot of details, but it's sort of been widely reported what some of the big, broader issues are and some of the more specific ones within the bills themselves. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. One is probably the big one that sort of makes sense to most people, is that the Senate DFL, DFL obviously controls the state Senate narrowly. They've proposed some sort of tax increases to raise revenue. So one of them is like a tax on large social media companies. Now, the House is tied, so the GOP has equal influence. When it comes to taxes, the House and the Senate are just not going to see eye to eye. So that's kind of a broader issue that they've got to work through in terms of how to raise revenue, what to spend on. So those big things are probably slowing them down a little bit. To what extent, we don't know. But then the more narrow issues, the two that have really jumped out, one is in the education bill, which the House has yet to bring to the floor, still stalled there, partly because they're fighting over whether hourly school workers should get summer unemployment benefits. So that's kind of a partisan wedge issue that has stalled that in the House. And then the one that's really been big, and there was just a news conference about this afternoon, is healthcare access for undocumented immigrants in Minnesota. So that was passed and is law currently under a DFL passed bill that took effect this year. But Republicans in the House have made it a priority to roll that back. And that is a big thing in the health bill. The House passed a health bill earlier this week that just didn't address that at all. So they're going to have to deal with that when the House and Senate get together. That's another one of those issues that's kind of been described as a sticking point, if you will.
Okay, so taxes and immigration, those are big ideological divides between the parties, both here in Minnesota and nationally. So let's talk about how this works or doesn't work. If they don't get to that May 19th deadline, it doesn't seem like they will, it doesn't mean the government shuts down automatically, right?
Yes, they have until the end of June. So July 1st would be the date, that would be the shutdown date. So they'd have to call a special session if they don't finish by May 19th. Only the governor can call a special session. So there's already some talk, at least from Governor Walz and then some of the DFL leaders, that if they were to need a special session, maybe it would be a short one. They've compared it to 2019, saying that, well, they could get almost everything done by Monday's deadline, and then they would just finish up later in the week. Now, whether that's actually a possibility, I don't know. That's just kind of what they've said. But that's at least being talked about, that maybe it would be a quick special session. Of course, you never know how talks are going to develop.
We know the temperature of politics in this country is a teensy bit warm. There's not a lot of love across the aisle, as they say in your line of work. But when we get to Minnesota and you see the lawmakers coming in and out of that room where it happens from both sides of the aisle, do you sense that are they having dignified conversations, or is this just a yelling, shouting match saying, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong?
No, I think and the governor said yesterday he thought it was pretty cordial. And I agree with that. I mean, especially in the House, I mean, the co-chairs have been operating very well for the last couple of months. Republicans and Democrats, rotating gavels in the committees, working together on compromise bills. For the most part, it's been going pretty well. And then there's just some obvious ideological differences. That's just the nature of a divided government. I don't know if it's just very unique this year because the House is tied. So you have like one chamber that's split down the middle, and then you have another one that's controlled narrowly by one party. So it just makes for a unique environment. But I don't think it's necessarily personal animosity. At least it doesn't seem that way. It's more just major ideological differences that they just have to work to get past.
Denny, a lot of people that are plugged into Minnesota politics know that this session started off in a way that, at least in my time, I'd never seen. The Democrats didn't go to the Capitol for the first several weeks because of some differences of opinions on what was happening there. So with a shortened timetable, is there any truth in saying this is the Democrats' fault because they weren't here on time for us to do the work on time?
This is one of those that if you ask each party, you'll get a different answer. Of course,
Okay.
The DFL did basically walk out for the first 3 weeks of the session. And so if you asked many of the Republican legislators, they said there was critical work that was missed in those early days. They got started late on committees. The fraud committee, for example, said that they couldn't hold certain hearings for several weeks. And so there was certainly that sense that they felt like they were missing time. However, if you ask DFL leaders, they say, the budget targets, at least the early ones, were released right around on pace. The governor has said that things progressed as it usually does in a budget year. So it just depends on who you talk to and what impact that had. Just kind of depends on your political leaning.
Yeah, kind of the case in politics. It depends on which party you ask, and you'll get a wildly different answer. I also want to kind of educate our viewers, and you're the best to do it. You'd made reference to 2019 or other times we'd had to go into a special session. And you and I have talked about this, in passing. Going into a special session during a budget year, at least since the turn of the century, isn't all that unusual in Minnesota.
Yeah, in fact, I would say it's the norm in a year of divided government where you have a legislature that's not fully controlled by one party or the other. Of course, legendary John Croman, who just retired late last year, he kind of put together a list too, and you found it as well, just in terms of how many special sessions they've had. And yeah, it's definitely not atypical at all to have this happen in a year of divided government, just because it's so hard to get everybody to agree on a budget, especially talking about tens of billions of dollars and a lot of ideological differences. And so they have to just compromise. It's just the way it works.
An interesting point, too. I'd love to get your thoughts on it. Like my wife said to me today, well, then why don't they just make the session longer? And perhaps my cynical response is that, well, they'd still have a stalemate. It would just take longer to get there. It's kind of that deadline thing. It's like you're really kind of pushed to make a decision, and that only comes when it's like you're facing the edge of the cliff.
Yeah, it's like if you have an essay due, it's due May 19th, but if it was due May 26th, maybe you'd work until the 26th. So if you have that extra time, that's a good point. I'm not sure. And of course, Minnesota is different than other states. It's, I guess, about a 4-month session. Some smaller states, they only meet for, a month or two a year. And then a full-time legislature in like a New York or California, they meet all year. So Minnesota, the budget year is January to May. So they just have that finite amount of time to finish the budget. And I don't know if making the session longer would help. Maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't. But that's something that's definitely crossed my mind as well.
Well, it would make your life harder and your family's life
That's
harder
true.
for you as the
That's
political
true, yeah.
reporter. Has there ever been talk in Minnesota of having a full-time legislature?
Yes, it was brought up. I believe it was the DFL lawmakers who had kind of talked about that in the last couple of years about making it a full-time legislature. And the issue has come up again in recent weeks because there was that conflict of interest allegation with the Senate president because he was doing pro bono legal work for a client that was getting state funding. Of course, he was cleared of that from a committee having a conflict of interest, but sort of revived that whole thing of if you're a part-time legislator, a lot of times you're going to have clients or jobs that sort of mix with, if you're a teacher, you're going to vote on an education bill, that kind of thing, just the natural way it works. So, in a full-time legislature, there would maybe be less of that because your full-time job would be to be a state lawmaker. So that's come up, but it doesn't look like that's anything that would happen anytime soon.
Yeah, it certainly would probably cost more money. We would have to increase salaries, I would assume, to have make it a full-time job.
Yeah, yeah, and I think right now they make about 50,000 a year for. Of course, they work. It's not like they only work 4 months of the year. They're doing a lot of things in their district, in the off season, so to speak. But yeah, they probably have to raise salaries and things like that to do that.
Any talk of the adjourning the room where it happens today in time for tip-off of the Wolves game?
Yeah, yeah, I would assume that unless they're watching it in there, maybe they've just been having watch parties and they, get some snacks, some pizza, maybe just, sit back, relax. Maybe that'll kind of break the negotiations loose.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, you got to stop at some point. You got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them. Another one from Grandpa's wedges of wisdom that I was given. So if they get to end of day today and they don't have it done, does that mean we're not doing this? Or do they really go all the way up until the final minute, even though, as you point out, the governor said yesterday, you can't do that because the people that write the bills have to make sure the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed, the commas are there, the numbers are right.
Yeah, it sounds like no matter how long it takes to get this deal on the framework, it sounds like they probably would at least get as much done as they could getting into the Monday night deadline. And then after that, just see how much time they had left. But it's interesting, though, and I don't know how other states do it, but in Minnesota, you have the leaders and the governor negotiating the broader, they call them global budget targets. And that's sort of what the committees, the conference committees with the House and Senate trying to bring those versions together. They need those numbers to be able to complete the bills and then pass them and pass the budget. So you could have a deal here today or tomorrow or whenever. You just have to then finalize everything. So maybe they would get as much done as they could up till Monday and then just see how much more time they needed.
All right, Daddy Spiewak, I would say get some rest, but that would be patronizing you because it's not going to happen. We wish you luck.
We'll see how it goes. We'll see. There's only 5 days left in the real session. We'll see how long the special session goes.
All right, we appreciate it. We'll keep tabs with you. Thanks for being on The Plus tonight.
Thanks, Jana. Appreciate it.
You bet. That's all for us on Breaking the News Plus. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again next time, 7 o'clock.